Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for International Dialogues in Experimental Design, a panel featuring presentations by Julian Bittner, Liz Donato, and Aleka LeBlanc. My name is Olivia Casa, and I'm the Exhibition and Curatorial Manager at the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art, or ISLAA. Today's event is presented in conjunction with the exhibitions Max Bill Global at the Zentrum Paul Klee in Bern, and From Surface to Space, Max Bill and Concrete Sculpture in Buenos Aires at ISLAA in New York City. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the Zentrum Paul Klee, Fabienne Eggelhöfer, and Miriam Dossiger for your collaboration on this event. To learn more about the exhibitions, please click on the links provided in the Zoom chat. This program will begin with an introduction by Francesca Ferrari, the curator of From Surface to Space, which will be followed by 3 15-minute lectures by our panelists. Fabienne Eggelhöfer, the curator of Max Bill Global, will then join Julian Bittner, Liz Donato, and Aleka LeBlanc for an approximately 35-minute long conversation and Q&A session. We encourage you to submit your questions and comments for the speakers through the Zoom Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen throughout the event. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Francesca Ferrari, who will introduce the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for this lovely introduction. It is such a pleasure for me to introduce today's speakers. I have been a great admirer of their work for many years now, and I very much look forward to their presentations, which promise to be very deeply relevant to both the themes explored in Max Bill Global and From Surface to Space, these two twin exhibitions. So the first speaker will be Julian Bittner, who will present on the Ulm School of Design. Julian Bittner is an independent designer based in New York, originally from Geneva, Switzerland. His typographically inflected studio practice explores the tensions inherent to various dichotomies between typologies and what he calls the singularity of things, professionalism and amateurism, abstract systems and ad hoc vernaculars. He received a BFA from Art Center College of Design and an MFA in graphic design from the Yale School of Art. And collaborating closely with artists, curators, and institutions, he has received commissions from Jonathan Berger, Sam Conti, Anoka Faruqi, Mary Wright Gallery, Michael Stipe, Adams and Ullman Gallery, Art Papers, the Center for Comparative Media at Columbia University, New York University's 80 Washington Square East Gallery, and the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts. He is currently a senior critic and assistant director of graphic design studies at the Yale School of Art. After Julian's presentation, will follow a talk on the Valparaiso School of Architecture by Liz Donato. Liz holds a PhD in art history from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, where she specialized in modern and contemporary art and architecture in Latin America. Her research examines intersections between visual and literary modernisms in the Southern Cone, expanded poetics, and experimental pedagogies. She completed her dissertation on the ephemeral actions of the Valparaiso School of Architecture in 2019, and she's currently the research specialist at the International Center for the Arts in the Americas at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, where she manages the Documents Project Digital Archive. Previously, she was the Mellon Museum Research Consortium Fellow in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and an instructor in the City College of New York, the Parsons School of Design, and the Cooper Union. Then last but not least, the third panelist will be Aleka LeBlanc, who's a scholar of modernism specializing in Latin American art and architecture with a focus on Brazil, and an assistant professor at the University of California, Riverside. Her scholarship addresses paradigms of abstraction, institutional histories, and global modernism. She's currently at work on a book entitled Concrete and Steel, Artists in Industrial Brazil, in which she considers how a young avant-garde generation in Brazil's cosmopolitan centers reimagined their relationship to the rapidly modernizing society in which they found themselves. She was a co-curator of the exhibition Making Art Concrete, worked from Argentina and Brazil in the Patricia Fels de Cisneros collection at the Getty Museum in 2017, and she will present on abstraction and design. After these three wonderful presentations, the speakers will convene for a discussion moderated by Fabienne Eggelhöfer, who has been chief curator and head of collection, exhibitions, and research at the Zentrum Paul Klee in Bern, Switzerland since 2017. From 2005 to 2017, she was curator of modern and contemporary art, also at the Zentrum Paul Klee, where she realized numerous temporary exhibitions and collection displays. In 2012, she completed a research project on Paul Klee's teaching at the Bauhaus that culminated in an online database on Klee's teaching notes and the exhibition Paul Klee, Bauhaus Master at the Zentrum Paul Klee and the Fundación Juan March. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone to Julian, and thank you so much in advance for all your work.
Great. Thank you, Francesca, very much for that kind introduction. And thank you, Olivia and Fabienne and Miriam for organizing this great series of panels. So let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's working. So I'm going to be talking about Max Bill, the Ulm School of Design, and his notion of the artist designer. 4 years after the school opened, Max Bill left it. Without him, there would not have been a design school at Ulm. These are the words of Otto Eicher, writing in 1987, who was the co-founder with Inge Scholl and Max Bill of the Ulm School of Design. The originally proposed name of the Ulm School of Design by Inge Scholl, which in German is Hochschule für Gestaltung, which was an appropriation of the little-known subtitle of the Bauhaus, seen here in red, in the school's letterhead. So the proposed name by Scholl was the Geschwister Scholl Hochschule für Politik und Kultur, which translated roughly as the Hans and Sophie Scholl College of Politics and Culture. And within this proposed name lies the origin story of the reformist vision of the school. Max Bill's counter-suggestion was Bauhaus Ulm, for which he sought and received Walter Gropius's blessing. Eicher later reflected, quote, "We were naturally aware of the cultural and political aura that would have surrounded a school called Bauhaus Ulm. Our intention was not to redo a second Bauhaus, not to play a rehearsal. We wanted to stand out from it. Of course, Max Bill didn't want a rehearsal either, but somehow he wasn't hostile to some kind of new Bauhaus. He thought that the Ulm school could, like the Bauhaus, open painting, sculpture, and goldsmith workshops. For Walter Zaitchik and myself, this was unthinkable." Ultimately, Max Bill mostly got his way, as he mostly did, and the school's first 4-page prospectus directly stated that it was a continuation of the Bauhaus, but outlined a need for evolution to address newly prominent media and emerging disciplines. In the aftermath of World War II, in the war-torn city, the idea for the Ulm School of Design sprung out of an adult education center, the Volkshochschule, co-created in 1946 by Inge Scholl, whose father was then the mayor of Ulm, Otto Eicher, and friends. It offered a broad array of evening classes, including a few in design, whose aim was to help establish a new democratic culture and consciousness in Germany. However, within a few years, Scholl and Eicher, who would later marry, were searching for a way to broaden these ambitions and create a day school at the university level. Together with the writer Hans Werner Richter, they sketched out a vision one evening in the fall of 1949 in an Ulm pub called the Junge Hase, which translates to young hare. This image is of Scholl and Werner in front of the education center, and the sign behind them with the modernist unicase lettering was designed, or very likely designed, by Eicher. In a presentation document a few months later, they wrote of the need for a new Bauhaus and a school indebted to, quote, "the resistance and commitment to the objectives of Hans and Sophie Scholl," pictured here. These were Inge Scholl's siblings, who were youth leaders of the White Rose resistance movement during the war, tragically executed by the Nazis in 1943, and portraits of them would hang in the future director's office. Around 1949, Eicher and Scholl reached out to Max Bill in Zurich for advice. They were inspired by his burgeoning reputation and civic mindset and hoped to leverage his expertise and connections. That same year, on behalf of the Swiss Werkbund, Bill created the influential exhibition Die gute Form, Good Design, which opened in Basel and later toured around Europe, eventually making its way to Ulm. In relatively short order, Bill increasingly asserted his vision on the school. The original idea of a social sciences school suffused with design classes slowly but surely reversed focus. The aim now became a school a design school with a social science underpinning. Their vision called for a school that had an international outlook, was independently funded, an unprecedented idea in Germany at the time, and which proved unworkable, and a cross between a university and a technical college. It would combine a political education with design know-how, attempt to synthesize the dichotomy between high and low culture, and leverage new technologies. Originally, it envisioned a curriculum organized around areas not previously taught together: press and radio, information, image and film, including advertising, industrial design, architecture, and urban planning. Later that same year, after a key donation of 1 million Deutschmarks from the American High Commission in Germany, Bill was commissioned to design the new school's campus. The site was a heavily bombed hill, a hill heavily bombed during the war, and hauntingly, adjacent to the 19th century military fort, visible to the right, which had been used as a concentration camp for political dissidents in the 1930s. Oops. 2, we were looking to learn from his experiences at the Bauhaus. His views on design seemed to point the way forward. When the new campus was completed in late 1954, its uncompromising architecture, a collection of unadorned, economical, modular geometries made of reinforced concrete, painted brick, simple wooden frames, and exposed lighting, served as a potent reifying symbol of the school's radical pedagogy. Walter Gropius would say in his speech at the building's dedication, quote, "The Bauhaus has made its own way in many parts of the world, but I have only to walk into this building to realize that here is the place where it has most truly taken root." During Bill's directorship from 53 until 56, the school closed in 68, Ulm represented a kind of ultimate Gesamtkunstwerk. He helped shape the vision and curriculum of the school, designed its campus and many of its interior fittings, and served as its inaugural director. In this, he could be seen as following in the footsteps of other architects who have become strongly identified with the institutions they helped create. Henry van der Velde, an important mentor, conceived of the Weimar Applied Art School in 1907, was the architect of its new building, later occupied by the Bauhaus, and served as its first director. Walter Gropius famously did the same at the Bauhaus with the opening of its Dessau campus in 1925, as did Eliel Saarinen in 1932 with the founding of the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. Max Bill laid out his sweeping vision for the school in his inaugural address in 1955, quote, "We are clear about our goal. Everything we do at the HFG is directed towards working together to build a new culture. And the objective is to create a lifestyle that is in keeping with our age of technology. Present day culture is too badly shaken for us to be able to continue building at the top of the pyramid. We have to start at the base and scrutinize the very foundations." And yet tabula rasa, Ulm was not. The most direct way Bill sought to recreate the Bauhaus was by hiring prominent former teachers Walter Peter Hans, Joseph Albers, and Helene Nonna Schmidt, one of only 5 women teachers at Ulm over its 15-year history. They taught Ulm's year-long basic course in the school's opening year, later phased out in favor of a set of common classes across all departments. Bill also tasked them with training future teachers, such as the Argentine painter Thomas Maldonado, who would later take over the basic course in 56. And in keeping with the Bauhaus's goal of synthesizing arts and crafts, thinking and making, workshops in metal, wood, plaster, and photography were set up. However, Ulm's basic course differed from its precedent in the degree of emphasis it placed on contextualizing studio work with classes in the social sciences and humanities, including cultural anthropology, philosophy, psychology, economics, history, and political science, among others. Following the basic course, students continued their studies within one of 3 initial departments: industrial building, product design, and visual communication. Later, the departments of information and film were added. Another core component of the school, which was part of its original conception, but only implemented more widely after Bill left, were development groups that functioned as semi-autonomous design agencies working with the private and public sectors. The most iconic of these collaborations were product design for Braun and later a corporate identity for Lufthansa, still in use today. These and other commissions helped to bolster the school's reputation and bring in much needed revenue. But they were also a source of tension between the faculty, who received a percentage of the fees and royalties for designs they worked on, and they put pressure on the school's sense of critical independence from industry. Dr. Angela Thomas Schmidt, Bill's second wife, says he tried to empower the students to, quote, defend their products against companies if they wanted to change something. This was both a learning goal and a political attitude, since a product that has been well designed and made to last contradicts the ideology of the throwaway consumer society. Oops. 3. But in terms of principle, he remained, in our opinion, a prisoner of the Bauhaus. He remained an artist above all and reserved a special place for art. Bill's vision for Ulm comes into greater focus as it was increasingly questioned by the younger generation of design faculty, including Otto Eicher, Walter Zaitscheg, Hans Gugelow, and Thomas Maldonado. Gugelow had worked in Bill's architecture practice from 48 to 50, while Maldonado had published a monograph about Max Bill in 55. And the work of his wife, the concrete artist Lidi Prati, is on view in the exhibition. Bill held the conviction first articulated by his mentor Van der Velde that artists made the best designers, which suggested designers should first be trained as artists. In 52, he wrote, quote, I am still convinced that art has primacy for creative design. At Ulm, we regard art as the highest stage of expression and strive to make life into a work of art. This was pure Bauhaus. Sorry, that last line is not Bill speaking, obviously. Similarly, the Italian polymath Bruno Minari, a contemporary of Bill's, though it's unclear if they ever met, echoed the urgency of this thinking in a newspaper column entitled Designer's Art. Quote, culture today is becoming a mass affair, and the artist must step down from his pedestal and be prepared to make a sign for a butcher's shop, if he knows how to do it. For the group led by Eicher and Maldonado, this attitude represented a perpetual subjugation of design to art, while their desire was precisely to uncouple them. They proposed a pedagogy of design that leaned increasingly towards mathematical objectivity, team-based collaboration, and research methodologies of the sciences. And yet these differences of ideology and process are less easy to perceive, at least in terms of tangible outputs, during the school's history. In this picture is an espresso maker designed in 56, on the left, when Bill was still director, and on the right, a coffee grinder designed in 1960, 3 years after he'd left. The increased prominence of systems-based thinking is already evident in Bill's design of the school, a model of which is here juxtaposed with a student industrial building concept model from 1961. And his notion of what constitutes good form, though in his writing it remains somewhat abstract, argues clearly for a use and user-based rational design process that is echoed, if more precisely and theoretically, in the writings of Maldonado, and highlights a great deal of alignment. Where there is clear divergence is in the importance of pleasure derived from aesthetics, as Bill famously articulated in his 1949 essay, Beauty from Function and as Function. This student-designed wallpaper made in 57 embodies this tension overtly, and feels rather charmingly out of place at Ulm. For Bill, however, aesthetics also had a more fundamental and latent role. Like the architect Adolf Loos, whom he admired, he believed it had inherent moral connotations and political resonance. In his essay accompanying the exhibition, The Ulm Model at Raven Row in 2016, curator Peter Kappos extrapolates, quote, predicated on shabby and dishonest values, ugly objects would inevitably propagate those principles amongst their users, thereby harming the social fabric. Consequently, good form described an aesthetic standard that was at the same time, for the designer, a moral imperative. Bill's eventual stepping down as director in February of 56 was not exclusively, and perhaps not even primarily, due to differences in vision, but the result of an increasingly unworkable relationship with the school's co-founders and the wider leadership. While Bill's public politics were irreproachably democratic, his attitudes towards governance was autocratic and corrosive. As far back as 1950, Ingo Scholl took umbrage at a series of increasingly strident demands, writing, quote, I think we can continue collaborating only if there is a basis of friendly, open teamwork, unquote. These two images, taken just a year apart, feel symbolic. On the left is Bill seated formally at the head of the table of a faculty meeting. On the right, Inga Scholl, explaining the reasons behind his departure to students, is seated informally around an asymmetrical group of tables. In retrospect, Bill's vision of an arts-trained designer with claims to new territory and prerogatives, I think has mostly prevailed within progressive design programs today, at least in the West, including the design program in which I teach. However, in the context of increasingly hybrid cultures and plural societies, a singular consensus around a designer's social responsibilities was never desirable or retainable. What remains as relevant as ever is a designer's social responsibility defined within a plural framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Adele. All right, moving forward. So first, actually, before I get started, I just want to say that a lot of what I'm presenting here today is built on primary research conducted by Elisabetta Varela and Marita Garcia. And I also want to thank Jesse Rocha for some really interesting last minute research. So I'll tell you about a couple of recent question marks of findings that just happened, of course, in the last 24 hours. So in January 1958, the Jornal do Brasil published a 2-page spread entitled In Casa Própria. Let's see here. Okay. In Casa Própria, o Museu de Arte Moderna. After 6 years in temporary quarters at the Ministério da Educação e Cultura, the fledgling museum was prepared to inaugurate the first of 3 buildings on its campus. While the lengthy article credited to Teresa Trota was effusive, the 4 images that accompanied the text were somewhat peculiar. And this is what I alluded to just a few minutes ago, is now it seems that Teresa Trota, there's reason to believe that this was actually a pseudonym. I was trying to figure out who it was that wrote this article. And so this is, adds to the mystery of it all. So let's see. For example, rather than publish a photograph of the new building, a rendering of the architectural maquette was printed in the upper right-hand corner. Only a single work of art was illustrated, an iconic sculpture by Jean Arp, which, although the museum owned a copy, was still an unexpected choice in the context of celebrating Brazilian modernization and progress. The other 2 images, a pair of organizational charts, were centered on each page below the fold in what would have otherwise been rectangular zones of unprinted space. This seemingly heterogeneous layout, which combined serif and sans serif fonts, upper and lowercase letters, and inconsistent kerning, as well as other blank spaces, was in perfect step with the unconventional design and layout of the rest of the Suplemento Dominical in those years, when Amilcar de Castro and Reinaldo Jardim redesigned it on a weekly basis. And also just to point out, I find the overall layout kind of interesting. Each side of the page doesn't follow the same logic, and there's kind of more to be considered here in terms of interpretation. Including a chart of the museum's internal organization certainly makes sense. The primary purpose of this text was to introduce readers to MAM, and not only because it was entering an important new phase, but also because the institution broke with the traditional models of national museums that populated the capital. The chart that appears on the left under the heading, The Museum in the Present, sketches the institution's current priorities with predictable and generic categories, including collections, exhibitions, conferences, classes, publications, and administration. However, the chart on the right, illustrating the museum in the future, is entirely reconceptualized, wherein a newly formed contemporary cultural center is constituted with 5 discrete departments: the Museum of Modern Art, a theater and auditorium, a publisher, a roster of independent courses, and the Escola Técnica de Criação, all operating together under a single organ. Yet my attention is repeatedly drawn back to the asterisk placed just after that heading. This tiny graphic sign directs us to a line of minuscule font in the lower margin, explaining that this future museum is still a tentative idea, although based on plans that already exist. And this is what's peculiar to me. Why is it that at the moment everyone would be celebrating the inauguration of a long-awaited building, and one would imagine the years of toil that were required to achieve this goal? The museum's administration is already reconceptualizing that very institution into something much larger and far more ambitious. Furthermore, why are they publishing plans that are still only tentative? On the one hand, this reorganization and expansion is evidence of what has been described as a national obsession with planning for the future, while often ignoring the past, which characterized many of the initiatives, both public and private, large and small, during the 1950s. Indeed, Mario Pedrosa diagnosed these desires with his oft-repeated remark that Brazil was always, quote, condemned to modernity. I've always found the meaning or intention behind this quip a bit obscure. On the one hand, it seems to suggest that for Brazil, modernity always remained elusive and an inherent kind of dissatisfaction with the present. But this interpretation, I think, is very culturally determined and probably says more about my cultural context in 2021 than Brazil in 1958. What if instead Pedrosa was expressing optimism, wherein Brazil is always in the process of formation and improvement, in which case the present should be seen as the bedrock for what's to come, not something to be replaced. By entertaining a more optimistic interpretation, the asterisk's message shifts, because while it anticipates what the future museum will provide, it also speaks to the importance of the actions of the current leadership. At the time of publication, Neomar Moniz Sodré had directed the museum for 7 years, and the prominence of the museum's educational mission defined and distinguished her tenure at the helm. Prioritizing the construction of the educational wing, or the Blocco Escola, even before the exhibition galleries, further underscores the administration's commitment to the educational profile of the institution. Designed to accommodate the full range of didactic initiatives, the building included classrooms and studios, a cantina for students, and even apartments for visiting professors. Her objective with the museum was much broader than traditional approaches to the collecting and display of art, or what had been customary in Brazilian institutions for decades. With MAM, she aspired to create a space where ideas could foment and eventually transform into new objects and forms. For Moniz Sodré, both endeavors, showing art on the one hand and making art on the other, were of equal importance. Instead of a mausoleum, the Modern Art Museum would function as an incubator, albeit one made of reinforced concrete and large plates of glass. Neomar assumed the directorship in 1951 and embodied the optimism and audacity that characterizes many areas of development during the decade. In the span of 7 years, she catapulted a small museum that had mostly functioned as a folly for Rio's cultural elite into a dynamic and internationally recognized institution. She was savvy in her ability to maneuver within Brazil's bureaucratic systems, keeping in mind that Rio was still the capital then, court wealthy individuals, and leverage her husband's newspaper, the Correio de Manhã, to promote the museum. However, it was the coterie of intellectuals that she surrounded herself with who left the most indelible marks on the museum. Mario Pedrosa, for example, worked with her from the very start in '51, organizing exhibitions and publishing catalogs, and even more significantly, brought Ivan Serpa to teach at MAM in 1952. Once there, Serpa began to develop courses, specifically an open studio wherein he employed a radical new pedagogy based on experimental and experiential learning, which stood in stark contrast to traditional methods of instruction based on entrenched exercises and outmoded hierarchies. Carmen Portinho, one of Brazil's first female engineers, also collaborated with Neomar from the start, with a specific purview of overseeing the construction of the museum campus. And there is a fourth figure who, although geographically distant, was equally instrumental in shaping the museum during its first decade, particularly the programming related to the field of design, the Argentine artist, graphic designer, and pedagogue, Tomás Maldonado. With interlocutors such as Mario, Ivan, Carmen, and Tomas, Neomar had surrounded herself with like-minded individuals, each possessing the same enterprising spirit and bold thinking that she exemplified as the director of the museum. Maldonado and Monisadre shared a long friendship with many productive collaborations, and it's likely that they first met in 1951, the year that Neomar assumed the directorship and during Maldonado's first visit to Brazil. He had been invited by the avant-garde composer Hans Joachim Kollreuter, who was living there, to teach a 6-week course in Teresópolis entitled A Arte Concreta y a Polêmica do Formalismo. At the time of his first visit, Maldonado was still based in Buenos Aires, where, since 1944, he had belonged to a loose affiliation of like-minded artists that had explored the aesthetic possibilities and limitations of concrete art. However, gradually, his inquiry shifted away from fine art and toward the field of design, a process that was accelerated by his first trip to Europe in 1948, where he traveled for 6 months, establishing connections with artists and theorists, many who would become future collaborators, including Max Bill. His aesthetic orientation began to crystallize in his 1949 text, El Diseño y la Vida Social, wherein he speculated about substantive and meaningful ways in which the artist could contribute to everyday life. In this essay, considered by some as the first text published in Argentina, published in Argentina about the social function of industrial design, he insisted that, quote, the artist of the future has to enter into the universe of mass production. Following his own edict a year later, Maldonado, with his colleagues Alfredo Lito and Carlos Méndez Mosquera, opened Axis, widely credited as the first design and communication firm in Argentina, which I have to say is a curious choice for a name, considering the Axis powers had just fallen during World War II a few years earlier. It's an interesting choice. In 1951, he went a step further and founded Nueva Visión, Revista de Cultura Visual, a journal which featured articles about constructivism, concretism, architecture, urban planning, typography, and industrial and graphic design, not just in Argentina, but across the West. By the time Maldonado arrived in Brazil in early '51, he had both theoretical and firsthand knowledge of the way design was operating in Argentina's industrializing economy. Even as his fields of interest expanded, Maldonado continued to paint, although he abandoned some of the more radical propositions of the 1940s and contented himself making geometric compositions with traditional materials, oil paint on canvas, framed in rectangular frames and hung on the wall. So that the next time he traveled to MAM in 1953, it was for an exhibition of abstract works from Argentina sponsored by MAM. The museum's archives have several photographs showing Maldonado and Monisadre together, and their friendship is easily detected in their relaxed postures and jovial expressions. This was also around the time that Maldonado left Buenos Aires and moved permanently to Ulm, Germany, where he joined the faculty of the newly formed Hochschule für Gestaltung. And I have to say, these, just an aside, I'm sorry, cat in the way. The pictures here of Jaime Mauricio, who's a critic, yeah, there's something about his facial expressions that make me laugh. He seems startled or something. Okay, let's see. Although Maldonado and Neomar met several times over the course of the 50s in Brazil, France, and Germany, thanks in large part to the increasing availability of commercial air travel, it is in their epistolary exchanges that one can detect their true camaraderie, as they shared professional challenges and aspirations with one another. One of the themes that emerges in their letters is profound agreement about the importance of education for the generations coming of age after World War II. During these years, it was widely believed that education was one of the most important tools to safeguard against repeating the atrocities of the war. Broadly, education would enlighten citizens, imbuing them with reason and a newfound sense of humanity, and more specifically, with a visual appreciation for their modern world, informing their relationship with industry and its potentials toward positive ends rather than destructive. In 1956, during Tomas's subsequent visit to MAM, he gave an impassioned speech on the subject. entitled Educação em face da Segunda Revolução Industrial. He began with an especially dire prediction, quote, "It can be said without exaggeration that the future of our industrial civilization depends on the success or failure of the reforms to education." To further emphasize his point, Maldonado put it in political terms, describing how education had entered the arms race and become a strategic tool marshaled by the new world powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, to create advantage during the steady expansion of the Cold War. In short, to Maldonado's eyes, the potential for catastrophic annihilation was already in place, unless there was a rapid and widespread implementation of aesthetic and design curricula that would help orient young students toward positive ends rather than self-destruction. If, during Mom's first few years, SERPA's classes were intended to expose students to new forms and materials, by the mid-50s, this agenda had broadened to promote design thinking. In fact, the reasons for Maldonado's 1956 visit to Mom had been twofold. First, to install an exhibition dedicated to the Ulm school where he was teaching, which had really only been in operation for about a year. And second, to develop the curriculum for the museum's future Escola Técnica de Criação, an institute dedicated to design instruction. Of all of the initiatives in which Maldonado and Moniz Sodré collaborated, the development of the Escola Técnica de Criação was by far the boldest. Since Maldonado was installed as a professor at the Ulm School and eventually became its rector in 1957, he was the ideal candidate to develop the new institute, which was modeled after its German counterpart. He and Neomar began working on the plan in earnest in 55, and by 58, when the Blockwa Schola opened, the structure and curriculum of the ETC was well developed, hence the reference to in the Suplemento Dominical, which I started this talk with. They planned to admit 20 applicants per year between the ages of 18 and 28 for studies that would last 4 years. The first 2 were spent in fundamentals, and then students worked in their areas of specialization. As described by Trota in the Suplemento, there were 2 paths offered. One that focused on visual communication, described as communication between men from press to television, and the other focusing on industrial integration, which related to the, quote, material tools of modern life from utensils to urban planning. And during Julian's talk, I was actually struck by how similar the kind of descriptions of Ulm and the curricula at Ulm, the kind of as it evolved, really are almost taken word for word and implemented here. As with other courses offered by MOM, the education would be both theoretical and practical, providing opportunities for students to be hired by the private sector to produce everything from the design and production of appliances, as well as conceptualizing corporate identities and advertising campaigns. So here in the next couple of slides, I just want to show you, this was a draft, kind of an earlier blueprint for the curriculum. And you can see that there are little annotations written around, I presume by Maldonado, that were then incorporated into the version I was just showing you a second ago. There are a couple of interesting things here that I just want to draw your attention to. One is that the notes made by Maldonado, for one, he argues for dropping the word criação, although here it's written, it's kind of a combination between the Spanish and the Portuguese version. So he writes, even though creation is an important term, it's too romantic or emotional and doesn't account for the future technological development where he believes the industrial designer or the production engineer will supersede the creator. And he also suggests a name change. Here you can see getting rid of this term, right, of creation, and instead referring to it as Escuela Superior del Diseño para la Industria, which is rather prescient because it goes on to the museum, or the institution goes on to have a name quite similar to that. Maldonado visited Neomar at the museum once more that decade. In 1959, Brazil hosted the International Art Critics Association's annual meeting in September, conceptualized by Pedrosa around a timely and utopian theme, the new city, a synthesis for the arts. 65 foreign delegates, including the organization's president, James Johnson Sweeney, as well as many other esteemed members such as Meyer Shapiro, Giulio Carlo Argan, Bruno Zevi, and Maldonado, spent 10 days touring Brasilia, Sao Paulo, and Rio. In addition to participating in the ICA conference, Maldonado was joined by Otto Eicher, his colleague in Ulm, and they led the first 2 courses offered by the ETC, Elements of Visual Communication. This course, which ran from August 20th through September 15th, addressed both theory and practice and really strongly reflected the Ulm pedagogy. 2 more courses were offered in '62. Brazilian designers Alexandre Vollner and Aloysio Magalhães taught Artes Gráficas, and Max Bantz, another Ulm professor, offered the class Visualidade e Estética. However, after this attempt, no other courses were offered. Establishing the Institute was prohibitively expensive for MOM, and fundraising became impossible, especially as the economy began a rapid decline in the early '60s due to enormous national debt incurred through all the large-scale development projects of the '50s, such as the building of Brasilia. Ultimately, MOM partnered with the state of Guanabara to finance the school, but due to political maneuvering on the part of the Secretary of Education and Culture, Carlos Flexo Ribeiro, one of MOM's trustees with political ambitions, the concept of the school was transferred to the state government in 1962. This more or less coincided with Neomar's departure from the museum and her assuming the responsibility for the Correio de Manhã after the death of her husband in August of '63. The state of Guanabara opened the institute under the name Escola Superior de Desenho Industrial in 1963 in Rio's Lapa neighborhood, where it's still in operation. And these are snapshots that I took a couple of years ago, and I love this kind of Wollner Bergmiller sign here on the right. So most historical narratives about the '50s in Brazil celebrate monumentality. The building of Brasilia is the perfect case in point. Instead, the history I've presented today is only possible if we also consider the diminutive remains, such as an asterisk or a neglected annotation. Thank you.
And thank you to Olivia and the ISLAA team for the invitation to participate in this conversation, and to Francesca for organizing such a thoughtful and beautiful show, which I think very importantly expands our understanding of the kinds of international dialogues that were taking place among South American artists and designers and their peers in Europe, as well as for its emphasis on the role of sculpture in the arte concreto movements, which of course is of great interest to me, having worked on the Valparaiso school where the sculptor Claudio Girola spent the vast majority of his career. I was invited to speak about the Valparaiso School in the context of experimental design pedagogies inspired by the Bauhaus and international design dialogues. Yet I anticipate my case study will be more of the idiosyncratic outlier in this conversation. The Valparaiso School departed from predominant manifestations of Bauhaus lineages and the ascendance of the Ulm model in South American post-war architecture and design education, even though it initially strategically positioned itself in relation to key figures, thinkers, and schools associated with both the Bauhaus and Ulm in the region. Rather, today, I will focus on how enduring dialogues with Argentine concrete artists such as Girola and the Asociación de Arte Concreto Invención and Madi artist Carmelo Ardenquin shaped the pedagogical vision of the Valparaiso School, particularly in regard to its conception of the relationship between art object and surrounding environment. So I will be focusing less on design as a discipline and more on the aesthetic influences that shaped its pedagogy. But since we are on a panel devoted to Max Bill, I would like to begin with an anecdote from Ulm. In the late 1950s, the architectural historian and critic, the architectural historian and critic Joseph Ripwort had the opportunity to meet the Argentine poet Godofredo Iomi, who was a co-founder of the Valparaiso School at the Ulm School of Design. Iomi and several of his colleagues from Valparaiso were visiting Ulm, likely at the invitation of Tomás Maldonado, who was at that time newly made director of the school. Iommi apparently made quite the impression on Rickert, who called the poet, quote, a brilliant meteor against the gray flannel of the Ulm backdrop, which he also disparaged as, quote, dumb positivism in managerial disguise, end quote. Despite Rickert's retrospective and provocative remarks, he accurately observed the stark contrast between the Valparaiso school's poetically inflected pedagogy and the Ulm model's functionalist program. The Valparaiso School was founded in 1952, initially as a rejection of the major schools of architecture in the country and the architectural establishment. The school's other co-founder, Chilean architect Alberto Cruz, had already established a reputation for his unconventional teaching methods at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, and was part of a faction of professors pushing to modernize the curriculum, which until the mid-1940s was still largely based on a Beaux-Arts classical tradition. He was aware of and engaged with Bauhaus principles and pedagogical theories. So here you see an example of one of the courses he developed with the architect Alberto Piwanka, a preliminary course in part derived from the Bauhaus model that was intended for first-year students to develop an intuition of space and plastic sensibility through formal exercises based on material, color, and form. Around the same time, he befriended Golo Iommi, who ended up in Chile by accident after traveling or participating in this geopoetic voyage with a group of Argentine and Brazilian poets known as the Santa Hermandad de la Vigilia. Cruz and Iommi started engaging in, at that time, controversial methods, such as encouraging students to abandon the studio for the streets, defiantly wandering the city without a fixed agenda or destination. In this type of exercise, they emphasized the role of observation and study and direct engagement and encounter with urban phenomena. Ultimately, disagreements about the direction of the reform movement, in which Cruz played an active role, and internecine battles among professors at La Católica led to Cruz's controversial dismissal. But soon enough, in 1952, he was offered a position to lead the Department of Architecture at the Catholic University in Valparaiso, which hired a new Jesuit rector. He accepted on the condition that he and his collaborators in Santiago would also be offered positions in the new department, including Iommi, a poet without a university degree. The administration agreed, and as a group, they defected to the coast. So I also want to point out that in 1953, just a year after the Valparaiso School is founded, is when the faculty at La Católica invites Albers to visit as a guest lecturer, where he teaches the preliminary course at this time, influenced by his teaching in the United States. Also at the Universidad de Chile, the Hungarian architect Tibor Weiner, who was Hans Meyer's student at the Bauhaus, was already on the faculty. So it was really in these schools of architecture in Santiago where there was a greater engagement, I think, with the various Bauhauses and teachers and theories. What really distinguished the Valparaiso School from other major schools of architecture was its emphasis on poetry and language, the idea that architecture must be co-generada with poetry. It turned away from more conventional sources in architectural history and toward an array of eclectic sources from European and Latin American avant-gardes. There is also a notable shift in landscape and setting in Valparaiso. Here you see the type of assignment they would have given students to locate a house in the Cerros using only a small scale photograph of the facade. So the labyrinthine topography of the city was conducive to the school's approach to experimentation. Early on, the group also established an informal institute, El Instituto de Arquitectura, an entity separate from both the university proper and the Department of Architecture. This division would ensure the group's autonomy to carry out its idiosyncratic, poetically informed actions and experimental research. It was also an entity through which they aspired to enter public and private competitions. That they called themselves an institute was also significant, a relatively recent phenomenon in Latin American higher education, which strove to incorporate modern science, technology, and research-driven initiatives. The Instituto de Arquitectura strategically positioned itself within a transnational network of interdisciplinary institutes that linked art, design, architecture, and industry. For example, in early reports, they cite other examples of institutes in the Americas. So they mention in passing they were regrettably unable to visit what I assume is the Instituto de Arte Contemporánea at MASPI, but they call the Instituto de Arte Moderno, directed by M. Bardi, and was recently founded one of the first art schools in Brazil dedicated to training artists to work in the country's rapidly growing industrial sector. And what I found compelling is that they call themselves, or they call it the only other similar institute in the Americas. And the IAC was engaged with Bauhaus precedent, both absorbing and disavowing some of its precedent, which Adele Nelson has written about. So the first public activity the new institute undertakes is the organization of an exhibition of contemporary art, the Primera Exposición de Arte Concreto in Chile, in which they invited artists formerly associated with the Asociación de Arte Concreto Invención, including Girola and Ennio Iommi, and the painters Alfredo Tito and Tomás Maldonado. Early on, there were strong links with the Argentine concrete artist Villa Godo Iommi, who was a generation older and on the margins of the Arturo group, but was aware of the publication and allegedly helped facilitate some of the connections between contributors and editors. He was also Girola and Ennio's uncle. Yet it was more than familial connections and the relative geographic proximity that motivated the Institute's decision to exhibit concrete art from Argentina. They believed their Argentine peers represented a coherent avant-garde movement in the Americas and early on exhibited a proclivity for abstraction. Chile, as I'm sure many of you attending are likely aware, was not a major epicenter of concrete art like in the neighboring Rio de la Plata region or in southeastern Brazil. The school's exhibition organizers therefore organized public readings to introduce local audiences to concrete art. Maria Cristina Rossi, who is one of the few to write on this Transandino connection, has stated that the show signaled the school's, quote, will to diffuse the vanguard proposition, end quote, in a small coastal city in Chile, outside major metropolitan centers where concretism flourished. The show was organized in 2 iterations, both very brief. In Viña del Mar, which is adjacent to Valparaíso on the coast, they organized a reading of a text by Italian architect Ernesto Rogers, and in Santiago, a reading by Max Bill. There was also a lack of a robust infrastructure for exhibiting contemporary art at the time, like in Sao Paulo, for example. The show on the coast took place in the wing of a hotel bar and at the Ministry of Education in Santiago. Yet the architecture for the venue on the coast helped facilitate a clear articulation of the school's emerging aesthetic philosophy. It's also the only extant photographic documentation at this venue. The photographs are not particularly high quality, so it's difficult to determine exactly which works are on view. Notably, however, there's not a marco recortado in sight. So all of the works or the paintings, at least, most likely are more recent and post-date the so-called heroic phase of concrete art after the return to the orthogonal frame in 1947 and the break from the Argentine Communist Party. This is also the moment in which, after which the AACI artists begin to embark on their own individual trajectories, many traveling to Europe for the first time, including Girola, who met Max Bill in Zurich, maintained contact with Bontongerloo, as well as Bruno Munari and concrete artists in Milan, who he would invite to exhibit in Viña del Mar in a second exhibition of concrete art. And at this point, Girola is still not on the faculty, but involved in the activities happening there. You can see in this show, the works by Munari were mounted directly onto the glass walls. So in the concrete art exhibitions, the sculptures took center stage. Iommi and Girola's sculptures framed views of the city against the transparent glass walls, in this way extending the concrete proposal of integrating the concrete art object into the surrounding environment. However, notably in this context, devoid of the political and ideological framework that characterized the heroic phase of concrete art in Buenos Aires. The display emphasized the relationship between work of art and environment, foregrounding the organizers' focus on the city. You can see in many of the photographs the image of Valparaiso across the bay. The focus on the city as a locus of study and experimentation, which would influence students' assignments and projects for sites in and around the school and the city itself, as well as Girola's own works in Valparaiso, and anticipated the ephemeral site-specific works he constructed in Travesias as part of the Amareda project, which is begun later in the 60s, in which he utilized readily available materials. They were intended to be ephemeral as well. So beyond the collaboration with the Asociación de Arte Concreto and artists, Iomi also collaborated with Madi artist Carmelo Ardenquin in Paris during the early 60s in the Grupo La Felene, an amorphous collective of poets, visual artists, and performers that engaged in poetic acts in public spaces in Paris, as well as in small villages in the countryside throughout Europe. Around the same time, Ardenquin was embarking on a new literary venture, the publication Ailleurs, to which Iomi and many other Madi artists would contribute. It was an eclectic publication combining contributions from writers with surrealist affinities and artists of various abstract tendencies, recalling the stylistic heterogeneity of Arturo and its internal contradictions. Both Ardenquin and Iomi pursued ludic approaches to their divergent projects and shared similar interests in the spatialization of poetry, but they would ultimately split due to disagreements over the role of improvisation and the written word in literature. Ardenquin maintained that Iomi's reliance on improvisation in a surrealist vein was outmoded. For his part, Iomi would explore the possibilities of travel, orality, and the embodied affects of the poet, whereas Ardenquin remained committed to the plastic and material possibilities of poetic form. The Valparaiso School also extended then the Madi emphasis on performativity and play, mobility, and kineticism, and this would become evident in its organization of performances, poetic acts in public space, and the incorporation of games into its curriculum, such as the torneos, and you can see Girola taking part in one of these as well. So in conclusion, I wanted to emphasize the way in which the Valparaiso School absorbed, adapted, and transformed these concepts that were central to the early Argentine avant-garde that ultimately distinguished it from the other ascendant models of architecture and design pedagogies in the South American context. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you, Julian, Aleka, Liz, for this absolutely interesting talks. We are a little bit late in our schedule, but we try to anyway to discuss a couple of topics that I feel are common to all these different contexts that you were talking about. And one thing that always strikes me when I read about these different design schools from the 20th century, it's always this conflict maybe, or conflictual relation between the fine art and the craft or the design or technique. And I mean, Gropius always said art can't be taught, and Bill also didn't want any artist at the school in Ulm. And at the same time, both of them thought that art is higher, has somehow the leading role also for design. And I just wanted to hear a little bit your also opinion about, is this a destructive or a productive tension between art and design? And maybe to Julian also, how is it today at the schools? Is it still this this conflictual relationship, or are they just two different topics and they don't touch each other?
I'm not sure, Fabienne, who you'd like to jump in first. But,
yeah, maybe you can start, Julian, and then we will go backwards.
I mean, certainly that tension kind of existed very much so at Ulm until Max Bill finally leaves for good in 57. And thereafter, I think the tension then becomes more about sort of critical autonomy and collaboration with industry and sort of the tensions that lie there. And I think, yeah, it seems to me that Bill, you know, is very much in agreement with Gropius and van der Velde before Gropius as well about this kind of hierarchical relationship and this kind of paradox of like, we don't want artists, but you know, maybe we want artists that are willing to defect, or we want artists who realize that the greater need of the moment requires them to change their focus. So, and I think in terms of schools, you know, art school today, yeah, I can speak for personally just about Yale in particular, but I think it's talking with colleagues on the West Coast and in Europe as well. There's always this I don't know, antagonism is too strong a word, but there's always a kind of ambiguity about, and maybe some figures interested in trying to decide where are the new lines between these two ways of working and sort of seeing the world. And but at Yale, I think you know, I think it depends a lot on the particulars of any setup. So in the School of Art at Yale, design is sort of in the minority camp where we're surrounded by the fine arts for the most part, photo, painting, and sculpture. So in a way, we're always needing to kind of just remind maybe the leadership in the wider university, you know, that what our kind of interests and prerogatives and kind of desires are. So there's always a little bit coming from that position, which I think is interesting, and maybe is an opposite to that, where I got my undergraduate degree in fine art was at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. And there I seem to be very good at choosing sort of underdog status, because at Art Center, it was the reverse. There was predominantly a design school, very close ties to industry. And there the tension was more with the art program, sort of what was its place, and was it, you know, was it were they the guiding lights, and whose sort of insights would trickle down to design, or was it somehow the other way around?
Yeah, and in Aleka, in your talk, that was very interesting. I think this word création, this creation, that for me embodies a little bit that he wanted more the technica than the création.
Yeah, when I came across that kind of, because I've often wondered how the title of the school kind of migrated and ultimately became SG. But I think going back to this kind of conflict that you were asking about between art and design, or this tension, I think for me in the Brazilian context, that's always functioned more kind of at the level of the rhetorical and or the kind of, you know, an aspirational curricula, perhaps. Whereas I think in practical terms, I think for the artists who were working at the time, who were painters and designers and sculptors and photographers and whatnot, I don't see that tension at all. Instead, I see them working very much in kind of a continuity, and these things being very kind of practices informing one another. I think even considering this tension comes from a position of privilege, actually. If you're in a country that didn't have a Bauhaus at all, right, and is only just industrializing, or is only really has, you know, whose kind of industrial sector has been slow to begin and is only now ramping up, and I'm talking about the, you know, the 50s, you don't, that's, you're not preoccupied with some sort of tension, right? I think they're at a moment where there's, as I said, there's all of this kind of optimism about engaging industry and not making the same mistakes that had happened in the rest of the developed world, right? Which led to the destruction of World War I and World War II. So if there's debate, if there's tension, I think it's in debate and perhaps in some of these conferences and talks that were given, but I don't think that it, really existed among the artists.
Yeah, I think so too. Also with Max Bill, I mean, in the exhibition we are showing now, there are artworks, but also designs he made, and we mix it, and you can see it goes together. You can't separate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And how was it in Valparaiso? Liz, you were talking about the poetic side that was important.
Well, as you could probably glean from my presentation, it's very distinct in this particular school, which I think was a lot less invested in disciplinary erasure. And the architect and poet really were the dominant voices throughout its history, kind of sometimes competing with one another. But I think overall subscribe to this, the artistic side usually consistently wins out. And other disciplines like design, which as a discipline in the school emerged later, it's a lot less prominent in a lot of the history, and even a figure like Girola is not as, I think, well researched or studied as the architect and the poet, who have really shaped the history and the archive and the narratives that get perpetuated about it. But yeah, it's a much more, I mean, I'm always fascinated about the links with industry that I think it was gesturing to, and it was very aspirational early on, because it really is ultimately a poetic project, which was why it's, it's regarded and continues to be regarded with such suspicion, and is ultimately very different from, I think, the models that we consider today.
Yeah, and what I also find interesting, if we look at the context of this school where they were founded, the social and political context, they were all in all these countries were in a phase of transition, or they were all developing nations, we could say, even at Ulm. But the difference, what I hear a little bit, that was in Ulm, it was very much the goal to have an international school, to have international students and teachers, versus in Valparaiso or maybe in Rio, I don't know, it was more a national project.
In Brazil, definitely, there was an absolute desire for that international component, and they, Albers was listed as somebody. I think Albers was on everybody's list, right?
Yeah.
He was absolutely listed as somebody that they hoped to bring. And of course, you have Otto Eicher or Max Bunz, who also come. Maldonado, of course, is not Brazilian. There was a lot of desire to. I mean, in Brazil at the time, being international was their form of kind of national pride, so to speak. It was, these things were kind of collapsed together. And I think in the same way that it was designed by Maldonado, and very much, I mean, I was very struck, Julian, with your talk of like these real, I mean, almost word for word similarities. So that, yeah, no, I think it was absolutely about, in Brazil, about being, inviting international experts to come, rather than always the Brazilians always feeling like they had to go elsewhere, right? Yeah. That they had to travel to Ulm, or they had to travel to other cities, actually bringing things back, having their city be the hub.
In the case of Valparaiso, I would say they were not so invested in the Chilean context whatsoever. They actually wanted to refound their school in Europe. So I think the international ambition is there, but also a regional one that emerges later on. But that's something I tried to pull out with the relationship with Argentina. But I think within Chile, they were not, it was not a national endeavor, and they were pretty detached from what was in the country.
I think at Ulm it's interesting because I think a degree of internationalism was a little bit a matter of survival, the way they saw it, because they early on sought funding from the Americans, and they also got funding from the Norwegian government, or a Norwegian nonprofit, I should say. And they felt that the success of the school really depended on kind of international almost buy-in, and maybe they also had that kind of maybe a certain arrogance of thinking that they were going to sort of, you know, disseminate their work and teaching internationally. But it is interesting that according to Renee Spitz, whose history I also relied on a lot for my talk, just under half of the students at Ulm were international, which was a really striking figure in relative to other schools in Germany that generally didn't exceed more than like 5 or 10%. So, you know, was it sort of a really representative spread? Probably not, but I think for its time, it was quite successful in that regard.
It was also very important for Bill, because he said we need international people coming to denazify the German, you know, education and culture, and therefore, of course, he also wanted this because then he was the perfect person to be the director of Ulm, because he had such a global network. So it played a little bit together. Another topic that I would like to address, we are in the title of our panel, we have this word experimental design, and I think for all these schools, the experimentation and experience are so important modes of education. So I would even say the process was important instead of the results. And I wanted to hear if you would agree that in the education of these schools, it was really more about process experimentation than having certain results.
Well, considering that the Escola Técnica de Criação never really came to fruition beyond, you know, a handful of classes that I think had relatively small enrollments. It's hard to know. I think in general, the kind of approach to education broadly, and of course, because of figures like, you know, Herbert Reed or Dewey, there's kind of definitely a change in education or pedagogical kind of approaches and philosophy, and that idea of experimentation and experiential, right? That it's not just about kind of performing certain you know, rote exercises, but it's about, you know, working with materials and having experience with new materials. I think that absolutely would have applied had it ever really kind of developed under the umbrella of the museum.
So that's maybe why Joseph Albers was so important for all the schools, because he was teaching you have to experience and to do it.
Exactly.
I would say that's definitely the case in Valparaiso, the emphasis on process over results, or at least that's my entry point into it. I looked at these poetic acts, these travesias, journeys, and games, these types of very unconventional pedagogical tools that I think were very central. However, I'm sure there would be students and teachers who would disagree with that assessment, but I think that's the overwhelming sentiment that I have, and I think what drew me to its process.
Mm.
My sense with Ulm under Bill is that strangely, for such a progressive institution, they were a bit single-minded about getting early, important, good results. I remember Bill, just paraphrasing, he says something to the effect to Ingersoll and Otto Eicher early on that getting sort of impressive results early is going to be key to our success. And part of that was because they were so dependent on support. Ultimately, they were dependent on support from the state and buy-in from local officials, even though initially their intention was to be a wholly privately sustained institution. And so I think they saw results as, and sort of that a kind of certain aggressive kind of marketing of the school as being imperative to keep it going. And I think perhaps that might have shifted a little bit under sort of the tenures of later directors, Maldonado and Eicher, where, and certainly as a kind of logical sort of reflection of their interest in kind of more scientific process-based ideation, and Maldonado, really insisted on a kind of user-centric kind of process, as opposed to maybe a more kind of Bill's also user-centric and sort of production kind of influenced process, but still leaving a bit more room for kind of imagination and kind of sort of artist intuition, perhaps.
Good. So I would look in the Q&A section. I have one question for Julian. You discussed the ethical imperative that Bill saw as essential to his design practice. As a designer working against the backdrop of ecological and political crisis yourself, how do you understand this moral aspiration and how do you approach it in your own design work, if at all? Do you see any space for design utopias in the Anthropocene?
Well, I wasn't really thinking about my own practice so much in relation to a figure like Bill and these other impressive figures. I think, as I just sort of allude to in the conclusion of what I said today, I do think that there is an increasing imperative to redefine design's sort of social responsibilities and kind of the ethics of design, but that this needs to happen kind of locally, can't happen in a kind of international sort of sense. So I think that it's a hard thing to do with all of the challenges, including the ecological challenges that we face. I think it's imperative. And it's such a large, the difficult issue that I wouldn't begin to say that I know what the answer is. But I think starting to ask those questions in an educational setting and soliciting as many different voices and trying to kind of define our responsibilities would be the first step, at least. But
thank you. There is another question for Aleka. What is the relationship between a reassessment and a heightened interest in local popular art and craftsmanship in the 1950s and design as an international language in Brazil?
Let me just read that again.
Okay.
So I'm just looking at, so between a reassessment of local and popular art and craftsmanship versus design in an international language. It's an excellent question. And it's, I think, I think a lot of the history about Brazil in the 50s is very focused on constructivist art, artist artist groups and individuals, as well as these kind of grand narratives about democracy and utopia and, you know, Brasilia and these huge urban, you know, changes to the urban plan and changes to kind of how the nation imagined itself, right, and wanted to project itself. But the reality is, of course, that only represents a very small group of people and practitioners. And in fact, it really leaves out the vast majority of the artists who were working at the time, and whether they were, you know, there are many other artists who were working with abstraction, but were not following the kind of, you know, the supposed strict rules around concretism or constructivism, and were somebody like Alfredo Volpi, for example, who was a quite successful and famous and revered artist of the 50s, who painted in a somewhat, you know, with geometric forms, but not following this kind of constructivist line. And so I think that the question around craftsmanship and popular arts and, you know, the kind of artisanal aspects of fine art have, for the most part, been, I think, quite ignored and left out of these kind of master narratives. I think, you know, very much, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind for me, for example, is Geraldo de Barros's Unilabor, which is this, you know, basically a furniture workshop that he establishes, which is about designing and making furniture that is, you know, can be easily produced and manufactured and distributed and inexpensive and all of these things, but it's all handmade, right? It's not, these things are not being, you know, made in a through any kind of real industrial process, but they're being handmade by artisans. And I think that there is that there's a handmadeness to a lot of the things that were being done at the time that I think has been kind of undervalued or just kind of dismissed as not, you know, it doesn't represent modernity. It doesn't fit with this kind of what was trying to be projected. So I don't know that I answered the question, but it gives me a lot to think about.
But at the same time, Lina Bobardi was organizing this exhibition at Must Be with vernacular Brazilian handcrafts. So she was one who was really pointing at, hey, we don't only have to look at Bauhaus and European modernism, but we have to look at the Brazilian vernacular, you know, popular culture that is here and handcraft.
Absolutely, but she was also an immigrant. She was Italian, and she had worked with Gio Ponti, and I mean, she was, and I absolutely think, and I think what she did with Habitat, with the journal she started, and I mean, absolutely, she was embracing and engaging with a huge landscape of visual production, but you know, she was still I think still a recent arrival, even though she became a Brazilian citizen quite early, I think in the early 50s. She would have still had a kind of a different perspective, and she was coming from Europe. As I said, she was coming from a place where there were lots of schools of design and architecture where this is something that you could study, and so there, to me, that's a different kind of creates a different relationship.
Good. I would have one last question, and I mean, most of these schools were heading towards rationality and technique and objectivity, or even collectivity. So there is not the artist designer with his name, but a collective should, you know, do design for everybody. But nowadays, I mean, if we talk about design, we still talk about the Inch chair or a Saarinen chair and pay high prices for these products. So do you think that this idea of good anonymous design for everybody has failed?
I don't think it's failed at all. I mean,
Mhm.
we have IKEA everywhere in the world.
That's
I
what I
mean,
say always.
yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah.
Yes, IKEA. Yeah.
And I think even, you know, when you go to buy, if you want to buy a new, I don't know, espresso cup or tea kettle or something like that, you have many, many, many options, and some have, better design than others, shall we say, or are over designed and don't function quite well. So
Yeah.
I think that there's a huge range of possibilities out there. But I do, find it quite ironic exactly that, an Eames chair, the price of an Eames chair, where this was something that was supposed to be available to the masses, is really out of reach. We often refer to the store design within reach as being, design out of reach, actually. So anyway, Julian, I'd be curious to know what you think, though.
Yeah.
That store could do with a rebrand, potentially, a renaming at least. Yeah. Yeah, what it makes me think of is that what happens, I mean, speaking a little bit more specifically from the discipline of graphic design, which I'm, sort of talking from, there is a kind of shift from design by individuals to design by design groups, starting in the 50s, but starting to take over in the 80s. And I would say that it succeeded, to answer your question, Fabienne, like, I would say most of the design that we encounter and interact with today is actually designed by anonymous groups, by often quite large branding agencies, international firms. And really, I think there's sort of been a backlash in a way in the last 20 years where people, the sort of on the plus side, they associate individual designer names or small, sort of deliberately small size design groups as adding a degree of authenticity to the design, whether it's, a product or an exhibition or a book or a building. And so I think that's the sort of this kind of tension between the corporatization of design and the kind of design by committee, which is probably not quite what Maldonado and Eicher had in mind, even at Ulm. But that tension is definitely there. And I think maybe one alternative, just to quickly throw it in here, is I think there are certain groups like the architectural practice Assemble in London, based in London, that is like 20 plus, or at least it was when it was founded, it was 20 plus individuals, and who kind of prize a degree of anonymity and work in this in a very particular way. There's something extremely idiosyncratic about their working methodology, but at the same time, it is this kind of anonymous group. So I think both, there's many things happening. It's really an era of pluralism where there's kind of no bad way to work almost.